Taking his cue in a somewhat obvious manner, Hastings replied, yes, I think I'll stay here. Well, as you please. Jap sounded surprised. He and Poirot left, followed by the young constable, and a moment later Barbara Amory entered from the garden, through the French windows, wearing a pink blouse and light-colored slacks. "Ah, there you are, my pet. I say, what's this that's just blown in upon us?" she asked Hastings as she moved across to the settee and sat down. "Is it the police?" "Yes," Hastings told her. He joined her on the settee. "It's, Inspector Japp of Scotland Yard. You've got to see your cousin now to ask him a few questions." "We won't ask me questions, do you think?" "Why, don't imagine so. But even if he does," Hastings assured her, "there's nothing to be alarmed about." "Oh, I'm not alarmed," Barbara declared. "In fact, I think it would be absolutely wizard. It would be so tempting to embroider a bit, just to make a sensation. I adore sensation, don't you?" Hastings looked puzzled. I really don't know." "No, I don't think I adore sensation." Barbara Amory regarded him quizzically. "You intrigue me," she declared. "Where have you been all your life?" "Well, I've spent several years in South America." "I knew it," Barbara exclaimed. She gestured with a hand over her eyes, the wide open spaces. "That's why you're so deliciously old-fashioned." Hastings now looked offended. "Oh, I'm sorry," he said stiffly. "Oh, but I adore it." Barbara hastened to explain. "I think you're a pet. Absolute pet." "Oh, what exactly do you mean by old-fashioned?" "Well," Barbara continued, "I'm sure you believe in all sorts of stuffy old things like decency and not telling lies except for very good reason and putting a good face on things." "Oh, quite," agreed Hastings in some surprise. "Don't you?" "Me? Well, for example, do you expect me to keep up the fiction that Uncle Claude's death is a regrettable incident?" "Well, isn't it?" Hastings sounded shocked. "My dear," exclaimed Barbara. She rose and perched herself on the edge of the coffee table. "As far as I'm concerned, it's the most marvelous thing that ever happened. You don't know what a low skinflint he was. You don't know how he ground us all down." She stopped, overcome by the strength of her feelings. Embarrassed, Hastings began, I wish you wouldn't, but was interrupted by Barbara. "You don't like honesty?" she asked. "That's just what I thought you'd be like. You'd prefer me to be wearing black instead of this, be talking in a hushed voice about poor Uncle Claude, so good to us all." "Oh, Bernie!" Hastings exclaimed. "Oh, you needn't pretend," Barbara went on. "I knew that's what you'd turn out to be like, and I got to know you properly. But what I say is that life isn't long enough for all that lying and pretense. Uncle Claude wasn't good to us at all. I'm certain we're all glad he's dead, really, in our heart of hearts. Yes, even Aunt Caroline. Poor dear, she stood him longer than any of us." Barbara suddenly calmed down. When she spoke again, it was in a milder tone. "I've been thinking. Scientifically speaking, Aunt Caroline might have poisoned Uncle Claude. That heart attack last night was really very queer. I never believed it was a heart attack at all. I'm just surprised that suppressing her feelings all these years led to Aunt Caroline developing some powerful complex." "Well, I suppose it's theoretically possible," Hastings murmured guardedly. "I wonder who pinched the formula, though," Barbara continued. "Everyone says it was the Italian, but personally I suspect Treadwell." "Well, Butler, good heavens, why?" Hastings looked perplexed. "Well, I'm very orthodox in some ways," Barbara remarked. "I've been brought up to suspect the least likely person. That's who it is in all the best murder mysteries, and Treadwell is certainly the least likely person." "Except you, perhaps, Mother?" Hastings suggested with a laugh. "Oh, me?" Barbara smiled uncertainly as she rose and moved away from him. "How curious," she murmured to herself. "Most curious." Hastings asked, rising to his feet. Something I've just thought of. Let's go out in the garden. I hate it in here. She moved towards the French windows. Oh, I am afraid I have to stay here, Hastings told her. Why? I mustn't leave this room. You know, Barbara observed, you've got a complex about this room. Do you remember outside? There we all were completely shattered by the disappearance of the formula, and in you strode and produced the most marvelous anticlimax by saying in your best conversational manner, "Oh, the delightful room, Mr. Amory." It was so funny when the two of you walked in. There was this extraordinary little man with you, no more than 5'4", but with an air of immense dignity, and you being, ooh, so polite. Nora Poirot is rather odd at first sight, I admit, Hastings agreed, and he has all kinds of little foibles. For instance, he has an absolute passion for neatness of any kind. If he sees an ornament sit crooked, or a speck of dust, or even a slight disarray in someone's attire, it's absolute torture to him. Now you make such a wonderful contrast to each other, Barbara said, laughing. Poirot's methods of detection are very much his own, you know, Hastings continued. Order and method are his gods. He has great disdain for tangible evidence, things like footprints and cigarette ash, you know what I mean. In fact, he maintains that taken by themselves, they would never enable a detective to solve a problem. But true work, he says, is done from within. And then he taps that egg-shaped head of his and remarks with great satisfaction, "The little gray cells of the brain always remember the little gray cells, mon ami." "Oh, I think it's a puppet," Barbara declared. "Not as sweet as you with your what a delightful room." "It is a delightful room," Hastings insisted, sounding rather nettled. Personally, I don't agree with you," said Barbara. She took his hand and tried to pull him towards the open French windows. "Anyway, you've had quite enough of it from now. Come on." "No, you don't understand," Hastings declared, taking his hand away from her. I promised Poirot." Barbara spoke slowly. "You promised Monsieur Poirot that you would not leave this room. But why?" "Oh, I can't do that." "Oh." Barbara was silent for a moment or two. Then her manner changed. She moved behind Hastings and began to recite in an exaggerated dramatic voice, "The boy stood on the burning deck. I beg your pardon, whence all but he had fled." "Well, my pet?" "I simply cannot understand you," Hastings declared in exasperation. "Oh, why should you understand me?" "Oh, you really are a delight," declared Barbara, slipping her arm through his. "Come and be vamped." "Oh, really, I think you're adorable. You're pulling my leg." "Not at all," Barbara insisted. "I'm crazy about you. You're positively pre-war." She pulled him to the French windows, and this time Hastings allowed himself to yield to the pressure of her arm. "You really are an extraordinary person," he told her. "But quite different from any girl I've ever met." "I'm delighted to hear it. That's a very good sign," said Barbara, as they now stood face to face, framed in the open windows. "A good sign? Yes. Makes a girl feel hopeful." Hastings blushed, and Barbara laughed light-heartedly as she dragged them out into the garden. After Barbara's exit with Hastings into the garden, the library remained unoccupied for no longer than a moment or two. Then the door to the hall opened, and Miss Amory entered, carrying the small work-bag. She went over to the settee, put the bag down, knelt, and began to feel at the back of the seat. As she did so, Dr. Corelli entered by the other door, carrying a hat and a small suitcase. Seeing Miss Amory, Corelli stopped and murmured a word of apology at having intruded upon her. Miss Amory rose from the settee, looking a trifle flustered. I was searching for a knitting needle," she explained, unnecessarily brandishing her discovery as she spoke. "It had slipped down behind the seat." Then, taking in the significance of his suitcase, she asked, "Are you leaving us, Dr. Corelli?" Corelli put his hat and suitcase on a chair. I feel I can no longer trespass on your hospitality, he announced. Obviously delighted, Miss Amory was polite enough to murmur, "Oh well, of course if you feel like that." I then remembered the situation in which the occupants of the house currently found themselves, she added. But I thought there was some tiresome formalities and... Her voice trailed off indecisively. "Oh, that is all arranged," Coretti assured her. "No, well, if you feel you must go, I do indeed." "Then I will order the car," Miss Amory declared, briskly moving to the bell above the fireplace. "Oh, no, Coretti insisted. That too is all arranged." "But you've even had to carry your suitcase down yourself. Really, the servants, they're all demoralized, completely demoralized." She returned to the settee and took her knitting from her bag. "They can't concentrate, Dr. Corelli. They cannot keep their heads. So curious, is it not?" Looking distinctly on edge, Corelli replied offhandedly, "Very curious." He glanced at the telephone. Miss Amory began to knit, keeping up a flow of aimless conversation as she did so. "I suppose you are catching the 12:15. You mustn't run it too fine. Oh, not that I want to pass, of course. I always say that passing of it, yes, indeed." Dr. Corelli interrupted her peremptorily. "There is plenty of time, I think. I wondered if I might use the telephone." Miss Amory looked up momentarily. "Oh, yes, of course," she said, as she continued to knit. It seemed not to have occurred to her that Dr. Corelli might have wanted to make his telephone call in private. "Thank you," moaned Corelli, moving to the desk, to making a pretense of looking up a number in the telephone directory. He glanced across impatiently at Miss Amory. "I think your niece was looking for you," he remarked. Miss Amory's only reaction to this information was to talk about her niece while continuing with her knitting undisturbed. "But dear Barbara," she exclaimed, "such a sweet creature. You knew she leads rather a sad life here, far too dull for a young girl. Oh, well, things will be different now, I dare say." She dwelt pleasurably on this thought for a moment before continuing. "Not that I hadn't done all I could, but what a girl needs is a little gaiety. All the beeswax in the world would make up for that." Dr. Corelli's face was a study in incomprehension, mixed with more than a little irritation. "Beeswax?" he felt obliged to ask. "Yes, beeswax. Or is it B-Max? The vitamins, you know, or at least that's what it says on the tin. A and B and C and D, all of them, except the one that keeps you from having Betty. And I barely think there's no need for that if one is living in England. It's not a disease one encounters here. Comes, I believe, from polishing the rice in native countries. So interesting. I made Mr. Raynor take it. A beeswax, I mean, after breakfast every day. He was looking pale, poor young fellow. I tried to make Lucia take it too, but you wouldn't." Miss Amory shook her head disapprovingly. "And to think when I was a girl I was strictly forbidden to eat caramels because of the beeswax. No, I mean beeswax, B-Max. That time has changed, you know. Times do change." Though he attempted to disguise the fact, by now Dr. Corelli was positively fuming. Yes, Miss Amory," he replied as politely as he could manage. Moving towards her, he tried a somewhat more direct approach. "I think your niece is calling you." "Calling me?" "Yes, do you not hear?" Miss Amory listened. No, she confessed. "How curious." She rolled up her knitting. "You must have keen ears, Dr. Corelli." "Not that my hearing is bad. Indeed, I've been told." She dropped her bowl of wool and Corelli picked it up for her. "Well, thank you so much," she said. "All the Amorys have keen hearing, you know." She rose from the settee. "My father kept his faculties in the most remarkable way. He could read without glasses when he was 80. She dropped the bowl of wool again, and again Corelli stooped to retrieve it for her. "Oh, thank you so much." Miss Amory continued. "A remarkable man, Dr. Corelli. My father, I mean, such a remarkable man. He always slept in a 4-post feather bed, and the windows of his bedroom were never opened. The night air, he used to say, was most injurious. Unfortunately, when he had an attack of gout, he was nursed by a young woman who insisted on the window being opened at the top, and my poor father died of it. She dropped the ball of wool yet again. This time, after picking it up, Coretti planted it firmly in her hand and led her to the door. Miss Amory moved slowly, talking all the time. I do not care at all for hospital nurses, Dr. Coretti, she informed him. They gossip about their cases, they drink far too much tea, and they always upset the sentence. Very true, dear lady, very true. Corelli agreed hastily, opening the door for her. Thank you so much, Miss Amory said as he propelled her out of the room. Shutting the door after her, Corelli moved quickly to the desk and lifted the telephone receiver. After a pause, he spoke into it softly but urgently. This is a Margaret Cleve 314. I want a lump of 3. No, 5-3. That's all right. Eh? What do you call me? Right. He replaced the receiver and then stood, biting his nails impatiently. After a moment, he crossed to the door of the study, opened it, and entered the room. Hardly had he done so when Edward Rayner came into the library from the hall. Glancing around, Rayner strolled casually to the fireplace. He touched the bars of spills on the mantelpiece, and as he did so, Coretti came back into the room from the study. As Coretti closed the study door, Rayner turned and saw him. I didn't know you were in here, said the secretary. I am waiting for the phone call, Coretti explained. Oh. After a pause, Coretti spoke again. When did the police inspector come? About 20 minutes ago, I believe. Have you seen him? Only in the distance, replied Coretti. He's a Scotland Yard man, Rayner informed him. Apparently he happened to be down in the neighborhood tearing up somehow the case, so he was called in by the local priest. Oh, that was a piece of luck, observed Coretti, wasn't it? The telephone rang and Rayner moved towards it, walking quickly ahead of him to the phone, and Coretti said, I think that would be my call. He looked at Rayner. I wonder if you would mind, Oh, certainly, my dear fellow, the secretary assured him. Up they're out. Rayner left the room and Coretti lifted the receiver. He spoke quietly. Hello? He said, Miguel. Yes? No, damn it, I haven't. It's a bit impossible. No, you don't understand. The old gentleman died last night. I'm leaving at once. Jep's here. Jep? You know this Scotland Yard man? No, I've not met him yet. I hope so too. At the usual price. 9:30 tonight. Right? Replacing the receiver, Coretti moved to the recess, picked up his suitcase, put on his hat, and went towards the French windows. At that moment, Hercule Poirot entered from the garden and he and Coretti collided. I beg your pardon, said the Italian. Not at all, replied Poirot politely, continuing to block the way out. If you would allow me to pass. Impossible, said Poirot mildly. Quite impossible. I insist. I shouldn't, murmured Poirot with a friendly smile. Suddenly Coretti charged at Poirot. The little detective stepped briskly aside, tripping Coretti up neatly with an unexpected movement, and taking the Italian doctor's suitcase from him at the same time. At that moment, Japp slid into the room behind Poirot, and Coretti fell into the inspector's arms. "Allah, what's all this?" exclaimed Inspector Japp. "Why, bless me if it isn't Tonio." "Ah!" Poirot gave a little laugh as he moved away from them both. "He thought, my dear Japp, that you would probably be able to give a name to this gentleman." "Oh, I know all about him," Japp affirmed. "Tonio is quite a public character, aren't you, Tonio?" "I'll bet you were surprised at Monsieur Poirot's move just then." "What'd you call that stuff, Poirot? Jiu-jitsu or such like, isn't it?" Poor old Tonio. As Poirot placed the Italian suitcase on the table and opened it, Coretti growled at Japp. "You've got nothing against me. You can't hold me." "I wonder," said the inspector. I'll bet we might have fought to look for the man who stole that formula and did in the old gentleman. Turning to Poirot, he added, that formula is absolutely bang in Tonier's line, and since we found him trying to make a getaway, I shouldn't be surprised if he's got the goods on him this minute. I agree with you, declared Poirot. Japp ran his hands over Corelli while Poirot went through the suitcase. Well, Japp asked Poirot. Nothing, the detective replied, posing the suitcase. Nothing. I am disappointed. You think you're so very clever, do you not? Snobbed Corelli, but I could tell you, Poirot interrupted him, speaking quietly and significantly. You could, perhaps. But it would be very unwise. Startled, Corelli exclaimed, What do you mean? Monsieur Poirot's quite right, Japp declared. You'd better keep your mouth shut. Moving to the hall door, he opened it and called Johnson. The young constable put his head around the door. Get the whole family together for me, will you? Japp asked him. I want them all here. Yes, sir, said Johnson as he left the room. I protest, Corelli gasped. Suddenly he grabbed his suitcase and made a dash towards the French windows. Japp rushed after him, grabbed him, and threw him onto the settee, taking the suitcase from him as he did so. No one's hurt you yet, so don't squeal, Japp barked at the now thoroughly cowed Italian. Poirot strolled towards the French windows. Please don't go away now, Monsieur Poirot, Japp called after him, putting Corelli's suitcase down by the coffee table. This should be interesting. No, my dear chap, I am not leaving, Poirot assured him. I shall be right here. This family gathering, as you say, will be most interesting indeed. A few minutes later, when the Amory family began to assemble in the library, Corelli was still seated on the settee, looking rather sullen, while Poirot continued to hover by the French windows. Barbara Amory, with Hastings in tow, returned from the garden through the French windows, and Barbara moved to share the settee with Corelli, while Hastings went to stand by Poirot's side. Poirot whispered to his colleague, It would be helpful, Hastings, if you would make a note, and mental note, you understand, of where they all choose to sit. Helpful? How? Asked Hastings. Psychologically, my friend, was Poirot's only reply. When Lucia entered the room, Hastings watched her as she sat in the chair to the right of the table. Richard arrived with his aunt, Miss Amory, who sat on the stool as Richard moved behind the table to keep a protective eye on his wife. Edward Raynal was the last to arrive, taking up a position behind the armchair. He was followed into the room by the Constable Johnson, who shut the door and stood close to it. Richard Amory introduced Inspector Japp to those two members of the family whom Japp had not already met. My aunt, Miss Amory, he announced, and my cousin, Miss Barbara Amory. Acknowledging the introduction, Barbara asked, What's all the excitement, Inspector? Japp avoided her question. Now, I think we're all here, are we not? He remarked, moving to the fireplace. Miss Amory looked bewildered and a little apprehensive. I don't quite understand, she said to Richard. What is this gentleman doing here? I think perhaps I ought to tell you something, Richard answered her. You see, Aunt Caroline and all of you, he added, glancing around the room. Dr. Graham has discovered that my father was poisoned. What? Exclaimed Raina sharply. Miss Amory gave a cry of horror. He was poisoned with hyoscine, Richard continued. Raina gave a snort. With hyoscine? Why, I saw... He stopped dead, looking at Lucia. Taking a step towards him, Inspector Japp asked, What did you say, Mr. Raina? The secretary looked embarrassed. Nothing, At this, he began uncertainly. His voice trailed off into silence. "Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Rayner," Jap insisted, "but I've got to have the truth." "Come now. Everyone realizes you're keeping something back." "No, it's nothing, ready," said the secretary. I mean, there's obviously some quite reasonable explanation." "Explanation for what, Mr. Rayner?" asked Jap. Rayner still hesitated. "Well," Jap prompted him. "Well, it was only that—" Rayner paused again and then made up his mind to continue. It was only that I saw Mrs. Amory emptying out some of the little tablets into her hand." "When was this?" Jap asked him. "Oh, last night. I was coming out of Sir Claud's study, and the others were busy with the gramophone. Yeah, they were all clustered around it. I noticed her pick up a tube of tablets. I thought it was the hyacinth, and pour most of them out into the palm of my hand. And then the Sir Claud called me back into the study for something." "Oh, why didn't you mention this before?" asked Jap. Lucia began to speak, but the inspector silenced her. "1 minute, please, Mrs. Amory," insisted. "I'd like to hear from Mr. Rayner first." "Well, I never thought of it again," Rayner told him. "It was only when Mr. Amory said just now that Sir Claud had been poisoned with the hyacinth that it came back to me. Of course, I realize it's perfectly all right. It was just the coincidence that startled me. The tablets might not have been hyacinth at all. It could have been one of the other tubes that she was handling." Jap now turned to Lucia. "Well, ma'am?" he asked. "What have you got to say about it?" Lucia seemed quite composed as she answered, "To make me sleep." Addressing Rayner again, Jap asked, "You say she pretty well emptied the tube?" "It seems so to me," said Rayner. Jap turned again to Lucia. "Well, you wouldn't have needed so many tablets to make you sleep. 1 or 2 would have been sufficient." "What did you do with the rest?" Lucia thought for a moment before replying. "I can't remember." She was about to continue when Corelli rose to his feet and burst out venomously, "You'll see, Inspector. They are to see your murderess." Barbara rose quickly from the settee and moved away from Corelli, while Hastings hurried to her side. The Italian continued, "You shall have the truth, Inspector. I came down here especially to see that woman. She had sent for me. She said she would get Sir Claude's formula, and she offered to sell it to me. I'll admit that I've dealt with such things in the past." "That's not much of an admission," Jap advised him, moving between Corelli and Lucia. "We know as much already." He turned to Lucia. "All of you to say to all this, madam." Lucia rose, her face drained of color, and Richard went to her. "I'm not going to allow," he began, when Jap stopped him. "If you please, sir." Corelli spoke again. "Just to look at that woman. None of you know who she is, but I do. She is the daughter of Selma Goods, the daughter of one of the most infamous women the world has ever known." "It's not true, Richard," the chair cried. "It's not true. Don't listen to him, or I'll break every bone in your body," Richard Amory growled at Corelli. Jap took a pace towards Richard. "Keep calm, sir. Do keep calm, please," he admonished. "We've got to get to the bottom of this." Jap turned to Lucia. "Now then, Mrs. Amory." There was a pause, and Lucia tried to speak. She began. She looked at her husband, and then at Poirot, holding out her hand helplessly to the detective. "Have courage, madame," Poirot advised her. "Trusting me? Tell them the truth. We have come to the point where lies will serve no longer. The truth will have to come out." Lucia looked pleadingly at Poirot. He merely repeated, "Have courage, madame. See, be brave and speak." He returned to his position by the French windows. After a long pause, Lucia began to speak, her voice low and stifled. "It is true that I am Selma Gertz's daughter. It's just not true that I asked that man to come here, or that I offered to sell him Sir Claud's formula. He came here to blackmail me. Blackmail, gasped Richard, moving to her. Rocher turned to Richard. There was some urgency in her tone as she spoke. He threatened to tell you about my mother, unless I got the formula for him. And I didn't do it. I think he must have stolen it. He had the chance. He was alone in there, in the study, and I see now that he wanted me to take the heist and then kill myself, so that everyone would think that it was I who had stolen the formula. He almost hypnotized me. She broke down and sobbed on Richard's shoulder. With a cry of, "Rocher, my darling," Richard embraced her. Then, passing his wife over to Miss Amory, who had risen, and who now embraced the distressed young woman consolingly, Richard addressed Jap. "Inspector, I want to speak to you alone." Jap looked at Richard Amory for a moment and then gave a brief nod to Johnson. "Are you well?" he agreed, as the constable opened the door for Miss Amory and Rocher. Barbara and Hastings took the opportunity of returning to the garden through the French windows, while Edward Rayner, as he left, murmured to Richard, "I'm sorry, Mr. Amory, very sorry." As Corelli picked up his suitcase and followed Rayner out, Jap instructed his constable, "Keep your eye on Mrs. Amory, and also on Dr. Corelli." Corelli turned at the door, and Jap continued to the constable, "Must be no funny business with anyone, you understand?" "I understand, sir," replied Johnson as he followed Corelli out of the room. "I'm sorry, Mr. Amory," said Jap to Richard Amory, "but after what Mr. Rayner has told us, I'm bound to take every precaution, and I want Mr. Poirot to remain here as a witness to whatever you tell me." Richard approached Jap with the air of a man who has come to a momentous decision. Taking a deep breath, he spoke with determination. "Inspector, what is it?" asked Jap. Very deliberately and slowly, Richard replied, "I think it's time I confessed. I killed my father." Jap smiled. "Oh, I'm afraid that won't work, sir." Richard looked astonished. "What do you mean?" "No, sir," Jap continued. "Or to put it differently, that cat won't jump. You're very set on your good lady, I realize, newly married and all that. But to speak plainly to you, it's no manner of use putting your neck in a halter for the sake of a bad woman. Though she's a good looker and no mistake, I'll admit. Inspector Jap, Sven Richard angrily, "there's no point in getting upset with me, sir," Jap continued imperturbably. "I've told you the plain truth without beating about the bush, and I've no doubt that Mr. Poirot here will tell you the same. I'm sorry, sir, but duty is duty, and murder is murder. That's all there is to it." Jap nodded decisively and left the room. Turning to Poirot, who had been observing the scene from the settee, Richard asked coldly, "Well, are you here to tell me the same, Monsieur Poirot?" Rising, Poirot took a cigarette case from his pocket and extracted a cigarette. Instead of answering Richard's question, he posed one of his own. "Monsieur Amory, when did you first suspect your wife?" he asked. "I never—" Richard began, but Poirot interrupted, picking up a box of matches from the table as he spoke. "Please, I beg of you, Monsieur Amory, nothing but the truth. You did suspect her, eh, Knight? You suspected her before I arrived. That is why you were so anxious to get me away from this house? I do not deny it. It is impossible to deceive Hercule Poirot." He lit his cigarette, replaced the box of matches on the table, and smiled up at the much taller man who towered over him. They made a ridiculous contrast. "You're mistaken," Richard told Poirot stiffly, "utterly mistaken. How could I suspect Lucia? And yet, of course, there is an equally good case to be made against you. Poirot continued reflectively as he resumed his seat. You handle the drinks. You handle the coffee. You are short of money and desperate to acquire some. Oh yes, anyone might be excused for suspecting you. Inspector Japp doesn't seem to agree with you, Richard observed. Japp. He has the common sense, Poirot smiled. He is not a woman in love. Woman in love, Richard sounded puzzled. Let me give you a lesson in psychology, monsieur, Poirot offered. When I first arrived, your wife came up to me and begged me to stay here and discover the murderer. Would a guilty woman have done that? You mean? Richard began quickly. I mean, Poirot interrupted him, that before the sun sets tonight, you will be asking her pardon upon your knees. What are you saying? I am saying too much, perhaps, Poirot admitted, rising. Now, monsieur, place yourself in my hands. In the hands of Hercule Poirot. You can save her, Richard asked with desperation in his voice. Poirot regarded him solemnly. I have pledged you my word. Although when I did so, I did not realize how difficult it was going to be. You see, the time is very short, and something must be done quickly. You must promise me that you will do it exactly as I tell you, without asking questions or making difficulties. Do you promise me that? Very well, replied Richard rather unwillingly. That is good. And now listen to me. What I suggest is neither difficult nor impossible. It is, in fact, the common sense. This house will shortly be given over to the police. They will swarm all over it. They will make their investigations everywhere. For yourself and your family it could be very unpleasant. I suggest that you leave. I'll give the house over to the police, Richard asked incredulously. That is my suggestion, Poirot repeated. Of course you will have to remain in the neighborhood, but they say the local hotel is very comfortable. Engage a room there. Then you will be close at hand when the police wish to question you all. But when do you suggest that this should take place? Poirot beamed at him. My idea was immediately. Well, surely it roll very odd. Not at all, not at all, the little detective assured Richard, smiling again. It will appear to be a move of the utmost, how do you say, the utmost sensitivity to you. You cannot bear to remain another hour. I assure you it will sound very well. But how about the inspector? I myself will fix it up with Inspector Japp. I can't see what good this is going to achieve, Richard persisted. Now of course you do not see. Poirot sounded more than a trifle smug. He shrugged his shoulders. It is not necessary that you should see. But I see. I, Hercule Poirot. That is enough. He took Richard by the shoulders. Go, and make the arrangements. Or if you cannot give your mind to it, let Raynor make them for you. Go, go. He almost pushed Richard to the door. With a final anxious look back at Poirot, Richard left the room. This English, how obstinate, muttered Poirot. He moved to the French windows and called, Mademoiselle Barbara. In answer to Poirot's call, Barbara Amory appeared outside the French windows. What is it? Has something else happened? She asked. Poirot gave her his most winning smile. Mademoiselle, he said, I wonder if you might be able to spare my colleague Hastings for just a little minute or two, perhaps. Barbara's reply was accompanied by a skittish glance. So, you want to take my little pet away from me, do you? Just for a very short time, mademoiselle, I promise you. Then you shall, Monsieur Poirot. Turning back into the garden, Barbara called, My pet, you're wanted. I thank you. Poirot smiled again with a polite bow. Barbara returned to the garden, and a few moments later Hastings entered the library through the French windows, looking somewhat ashamed. And what have you to say for yourself? Poirot asked in a tone of mock annoyance. Hastings attempted an apologetic smile. "It is all very well to put on the grain of the sheep," Poirot admonished him. "I leave you here en garde, and the next thing I know you are promenading yourself with that very charming young lady in the garden. You are generally the most reliable of men, mon cher, but as soon as a pretty young woman appears upon the scene, your judgment flies out of the window, citadel." Hastings' sheepish grin faded, to be replaced by a blush of embarrassment. I'm awfully sorry, Poirot," he exclaimed. I just stepped outside for a second, and then I saw you through the window coming into the room, so I thought it didn't matter." "You mean you thought it better not to return to face me," declared Poirot. "Well, my dear Hastings, you may have done the most irreparable damage. I found Carretti in here. The good Lord alone knows what he was doing, or what evidence he was tampering with. Oh, I say, Poirot, I really am sorry." Hastings apologized again. "I'm most awfully sorry. If you have not done the damage irreparable, it is more by good luck than for any other reason. But now, mon ami, the moment has come when we must employ our little grey selves." Pretending to smack Hastings on the cheek, Poirot in fact gave his colleague an affectionate pat. "Ah, good. Let's get to work," Hastings exclaimed. "No, it is not good, my friend," Poirot told him. "It is bad. It is obscure." His face wore a troubled look as he continued. "It is dark as it was last night." He thought for a moment and then added, "But yes, I think there is perhaps an idea, the germ of an idea. Yes, we will start there." Looking completely mystified, Hastings asked, "What on earth are you talking about?" The tone of Poirot's voice changed. He spoke gravely and thoughtfully. "Why did Sir Claud die, Hastings? Answer me that. Why did Sir Claud die?" Hastings stared at him. "But we know that," he exclaimed. "Do we?" asked Poirot. "Are you so very sure?" Well, yes," Hastings responded, though somewhat uncertainly. "He died, he died because he was poisoned." Poirot made an impatient gesture. "Yes, but why was he poisoned?" Hastings thought carefully before replying. Then, surely it must have been because the thief suspected. He began. Poirot slowly shook his head as Hastings continued. "Because the thief suspected that he'd been discovered." He broke off again as he observed Poirot continuing to shake his head. "Suppose, Hastings," Poirot murmured, "just suppose that the thief did not suspect." "Why, I don't quite see," Hastings confessed. Poirot moved away, then turned back with his arm raised in a gesture that seemed intended to hold his friend's attention. He paused and cleared his throat. "Let me recount to you, Hastings," he declared, "the sequence of events as they might have gone, or rather as I think they were meant to go." Hastings sat in the chair by the table as Poirot continued. "Sir Claud dies in his chair one night." Poirot moved to the armchair, sat, and paused for a moment before repeating thoughtfully, "Yes, Sir Claud dies in his chair. There are no suspicious circumstances attending that death. In all probability it will be put on to heart failure. It will be some days before his private papers are examined. His will is the only document that will be searched for. After the funeral, in due course, it will be discovered that his notes on the new explosive are incomplete. It may never be known that the exact formula existed." You see what that gives to our thief, Hastings? Yes. What? Asked Poirot. Hastings looked puzzled. What? He repeated. Security. That is what he keeps the thief. He can dispose of his booty quite safely, whenever he wishes to. There is no pressure upon him. Even if the existence of the formula is known, he will have had plenty of time to cover his tracks. Well, it's your idea, yes, I suppose so. Hastings commented in a dubious tone, but naturally it is an idea. I might not Hercule Poirot. But see now where this idea leads us. It tells us that the murder of Sir Claud was not a chance maneuver executed on the spur of the moment. It was a plan beforehand. Beforehand. You see now where we are. No, Hastings admitted with an engaging candor. You know very well I never see these things. I know that we're in the library of Sir Claud's house, and that's all. Yes, my friend, you are right, Poirot told him. We are in the library of Sir Claud Amory's house. It is not morning, but evening. The lights have just gone out. The thief's plans have gone awry. Poirot sat very upright and wagged his forefinger emphatically to emphasize his points. Sir Claud, who, in the normal course of things, would not have gone to that safe until the following day, has discovered his loss by a mere chance. And as the old gentleman himself said, the thief is caught like a rat in a trap. Yes, but the thief, who is also the murderer, knows something too that Sir Claud does not. The thief knows that in a very few minutes Sir Claud will be silenced forever. He is to be solved, and one only, to hide the paper safely during those few moments of darkness. Shut your eyes, Hastings, as I shut mine. The lights have gone out. We can see nothing, but we can hear. Repeat to me, Hastings, as accurately as you can, the words of Miss Amory when she described the scene to us. Hastings shut his eyes. Then he began to speak, slowly, with an effort of memory and several pauses. Gasps, he uttered. Poirot nodded. A lot of little gasps, Hastings went on, and Poirot nodded again. Hastings concentrated for a time and then continued. The noise of a chair falling, a metallic clink, that must have been the key, I imagine. Quite right, said Poirot. The key. Continue. A scream. No, that was Rutier screaming. She called out to Sir Claud. Then the knocking came at the door. Wait a minute, right at the beginning, the noise of tearing a silk. Hastings opened his eyes. Yes. Tearing silk. Poirot explained. He rose, moved to the desk, and then crossed to the fireplace. It is all there, Hastings, in those few moments of darkness. All there. And yet our ears turn us nothing. He stopped at the mantelpiece and mechanically straightened the vase of spills. Oh, do stop straightening those damn things, Poirot, Hastings complained. You're always at it. His attention rested. Poirot removed his hand from the vase. What is that you say? He asked. Yes, it is true. He stared at the vase of spills. I remember straightening them but a little hour ago. And now, it is necessary that I straighten them again. He spoke excitedly. Why, Hastings? Why is that? Well, because they're crooked, I suppose. Hastings replied in a bored tone. It's just your little manual for neatness. Tearing silk, explained Poirot. No, Hastings. This sound is the same. He stared at the paper spills and snatched up the bars that contained them. Tearing paper, he continued as he moved away from the mantelpiece. His excitement communicated itself to his friend. What is it? Hastings asked, springing up and moving to win. Potter stood tumbling out the spills onto the settee and examining them. Every now and then he handed one to Hastings, muttering, Here he swam. Another. And yet another. Hastings unfolded the spills and scrutinized them. C-19 N-23 began to read aloud from one of them. Yes, exclaimed Poirot. It is the formula. I say, that's wonderful. Quick, fold them up again, Poirot ordered, and Hastings began to do so. Oh, you are so slow, Poirot admonished him. Quick. Snatching the spills from Hastings, he put them back into the vase and hastened to return it to the mantelpiece. Looking dumbfounded, Hastings joined him there. Poirot beamed. It ain't traced you what I do there, yes. Tell me, Hastings, what is it that I have here in this vase? Why, spills, of course, Hastings replied in a tone of tremendous irony. Na, mon ami. It is cheese. Cheese. Precisely, my friend. Cheese. I say, Poirot, Hastings inquired sarcastically, you're all right, aren't you? I mean, you haven't got a headache or anything? Poirot's reply ignored his friend's frivolous question. For what do you use cheese, Hastings? I will tell you, mon ami. You use it to bait a mousetrap. We wait now for one thing only. The mouse. And the mouse will come, my friend. Poirot assured Hastings. Rest assured of that. I have sent him a message. He will not fail to respond. Before Hastings had time to react to Poirot's cryptic announcement, the door opened, and Edward Rayner entered the room. Oh, you're here, Monsieur Poirot, the secretary observed. And Captain Hastings also. Inspector Japp would like to speak to you both upstairs. We will come at once, Poirot replied. Followed by Hastings, he walked to the door as Rayner entered the library and crossed to the fireplace. At the door, Poirot suddenly wheeled round to look at the secretary. By the way, Mr. Rayner, the detective asked as he moved back to the center of the room, do you by any chance know whether Dr. Cavarelli was here in the library at all this morning? Yes, he was, Rayner told the detective. I found him here. Ah, Poirot seemed pleased at this. And what was he doing? Why, he was telephoning, I believe. Or was he telephoning when you came in? No, he was just coming back into the room. He'd been in Sir Claud's study. Poirot considered this for a moment and then asked Rayner, where exactly were you then? Can you remember? Still standing by the fireplace, Rayner replied, somewhere about here, I think. Did you hear any of Dr. Garridge's conversation on the phone? No, said the secretary. He made it perfectly clear that he wanted to be alone, so I played out. I see. Poirot hesitated and then took a notebook and pencil from his pocket. Writing a few words on a page, he tore it out. Hastings, he called. Hastings, who had been hovering by the door, came to him, and Poirot gave his friend the folded page. Would you be so kind as to take that up to Inspector Japp? Rayner watched Hastings leave the room on his errand and then asked, what was that all about? Putting the notebook and pencil back in his pocket, Poirot replied, I told Japp that I would be with him in a few minutes, and that I might be able to tell him the name of the murderer. Really? You know who it is? Asked Rayner in a state of some excitement. There was a momentary pause. Hercule Poirot seemed to hold the secretary under the spell of his personality. Raina watched the detective, fascinated, as he slowly began to speak. Yes, I think I know who the murderer is. At last, Poirot announced. I am reminded of another case not so long ago. Never shall I forget the killing of Lord Edgware. I was nearly defeated, yes, I, Hercule Poirot, by the extremely simple cunning of a vacant brain. You see, Monsieur Renaud, the very simple maggots have often the genius to commit an uncomplicated crime and then leave it alone. Let us hope that the murderer of Sir Claud, on the other hand, is intelligent and superior and thoroughly pleased with himself and unable to resist, painting the lily. Poirot's eyes lit up in vivid animation. Now, not sure that I understand you, said Raina. You mean to say that it's not Mrs. Amory? No, it is not Mrs. Amory, Poirot told him. That is why I wrote my little note. That poor lady has suffered enough. She must be spared any further questioning. Raina looked thoughtful and then exclaimed, Then I'll bet it's Corelli, yes? Poirot wagged a finger at him playfully. Monsieur Renaud, you must